I was sickened. I was sickened by the standing ovation. I felt like Hollywood is just spineless, en masse. And it really felt like, oh, this is a really clear indication that we're not the cool club anymore.
Walked free and also got a standing ovation. It was at this point Jim Carrey decided he had seen enough. Within 48 hours, in an interview that would be replayed millions of times, Jim said out loud what an entire industry had chosen not to say. What did he reveal, and what impact did it have on Will? Join us as we reveal what Jim Carrey actually said about the incident, the night everything changed and nobody did anything about it. To understand what Jim Carrey was responding to, the events of March 27, 2022, need to be examined in their complete sequence rather than reduced to the single image that circulated everywhere. The 94th Academy Awards at the Dolby Theater in Los Angeles was shaping up to be a night of genuine cultural significance. Coda was positioned to make history in the Best Picture category. Several nominees represented milestones in representation and storytelling that the film community had spent years working toward. It was supposed to be a celebration. Chris Rock took the stage to present the award for Best Documentary Feature, delivering a brief scripted monologue that included a joke referencing Will Smith's wife, Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head. The comparison made was to the film G.I. Jane, a reference to her appearance that did not acknowledge her alopecia diagnosis, which she had discussed publicly and which had caused the complete loss of her hair. The camera caught Jada rolling her eyes. What it caught next was considerably more alarming. Will Smith rose from his front row seat, walked with deliberate steps across the stage, and struck Chris Rock across the face with an open-handed slap that produced a sound audible through the broadcast microphones and visible to everyone watching in the room and at home. Chris Rock, visibly stunned, steadied himself and attempted to maintain composure, while Will Smith walked back to his seat and shouted from the audience twice for Chris to keep his wife's name out of a specific part of his anatomy, using language that was only partially bleeped depending on which version of the broadcast was being received. What happened next is what produced the full scope of the crisis. Will Smith was not removed. Security did not approach him. The Los Angeles Police Department, which was present at the venue, was reportedly informed of the incident and later confirmed that Chris Rock had declined to file a report, meaning no arrest was made and no formal consequence was initiated in the immediate aftermath. The broadcast continued. The award was presented, and then, approximately 40 minutes later, Will Smith took the stage again, this time to accept the Best Actor Oscar for his performance in King Richard. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Will gave a speech that acknowledged the pain of the moment without fully acknowledging what he had done, describing himself as a vessel of love while tears streamed down his face and a room full of people responded with sustained applause. A few hours after the broadcast ended, the couple's 23-year-old son, Jaden Smith, posted a brief message on Twitter, "And that's how we do it." Although he did not explicitly reference the incident, many interpreted the tweet as support for his father's actions. The altercation prompted strong reactions from fellow comedians. Kathy Griffin expressed concern about the broader implications for performers, writing that physically assaulting a comedian on stage sets a dangerous precedent. She noted that comedians already navigate difficult territory with their material and suggested the incident could create fear about audience members retaliating physically over jokes. Rosie O'Donnell also weighed in, calling the moment upsetting on multiple levels. She praised Chris Rock for maintaining composure and not escalating the situation further, adding that he showed restraint under pressure. O'Donnell characterized Will Smith's actions as a troubling display and criticized the behavior in stark terms. By the following morning, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had released a statement condemning the violence while simultaneously confirming that Smith had been asked to leave the ceremony and refused. The detail that Will Smith had refused to leave after being asked became one of the more significant pieces of information to emerge in the days following, reframing the narrative from a man who had acted impulsively and regretted it immediately to a man who had acted, remained in the room through the consequences, accepted an award, and left on his own terms. The gap between those two characterizations matters enormously in understanding what the night actually revealed. Into that context, 2 days after the Oscars, Jim Carrey sat down for a television interview and said the thing that almost nobody in Hollywood had been willing to say. Jim Carrey's revelation that landed so hard. Jim Carrey was not, at the time of the March 2022 CBS Mornings interview with Gayle King, a man without his own complicated history. A resurfaced clip from the 1997 MTV Movie Awards, showing behavior that had been criticized as non-consensual, had circulated widely in the days after he spoke about the slap, and a portion of the public response to his comments was shaped by that complication. That context matters and deserves to be acknowledged rather than ignored. What also matters is that the substance of what Carrey said about the Oscar night was specific, direct, and ultimately difficult to refute on the merits. The statement that circulated most widely was the assessment of Hollywood's collective response. The standing ovation given to Smith after the slap was described as sickening, and the industry was characterized as spineless, in a way that signaled the end of its credibility as a moral community. The phrase used was that the moment felt like a really clear indication that the entertainment industry was no longer the cool club it had positioned itself as. That framing, the idea that Hollywood had forfeited its standing to lecture anyone about anything by cheering a man who had just assaulted someone, was the observation that resonated beyond the celebrity gossip dimension of the story. The financial dimension of the statement was equally pointed. The position articulated was that in Chris Rock's position, a $200 million lawsuit announcement would have followed the next morning, on the grounds that the video was permanent, ubiquitous, and represented an insult whose lifespan would extend far beyond any single news cycle. The argument was not about money for its own sake. It was about the enduring nature of what had been recorded and what that recording would mean for everyone associated with the moment across years and decades. That assessment, delivered in March 2022, has aged with considerable accuracy. The most psychologically penetrating observation in the interview was not the financial hypothetical. It was the diagnosis offered for why the slap happened at all. When the interviewer suggested the incident had escalated to that point, Jim Carrey disagreed directly. The position taken was that the violence did not escalate. It came out of nowhere. And the reason offered for its arrival without escalation was that something was going on internally for Will Smith that had nothing to do with Chris Rock's joke, something frustrated that had been building and found an outlet in a moment that provided apparent justification. That observation, the idea that the joke was a trigger rather than a cause, was simultaneously generous to Will Smith and more damning than a simple condemnation would have been. The broader principle stated was unambiguous. The right to yell from an audience or express disapproval on social media is fundamentally different from the right to walk onto a stage and physically strike someone because words were said. That distinction between speech and violence, between disagreement and assault, is not a complicated philosophical position. It is the basic premise of civil conduct in a shared public space. The fact that it needed to be stated at all, and that its statement was notable for its rarity in the immediate aftermath of the incident, says something important about the environment Carrey was describing. What is perhaps most telling about the interview in retrospect is not what was condemned, but what was also said about Smith personally. The explicit statement made was that there was nothing against Will Smith, that great things had been accomplished, but that the moment in question was not a good one, that it was a selfish act that cast a shadow over every other person who was supposed to be celebrating their own achievement that night. The combination of moral clarity about the act with expressed goodwill toward the person committing it is a considerably more nuanced position than either pure condemnation or defensive rationalization, and it holds up under sustained examination better than most of what was said about that night. But Carrey's diagnosis, that something was going on inside Smith that was frustrated, raised a question that the next several years would spend a very long time trying to answer. What was actually going on? The marriage that was already over. When the slap happened, one of the most significant pieces of context surrounding the March 2022 Oscars incident arrived 18 months later, in October 2023, when Jada Pinkett Smith released her memoir, and began a press tour that contained a revelation that reframed the entire evening in ways that many people found difficult to process. Jada Pinkett Smith disclosed publicly that she and Will Smith had been living completely separate lives since 2016. The phrasing used in the interview with Hoda Kotb was direct and confirmed on record. It was described as a divorce without the legal paperwork. The couple had stopped calling each other husband and wife years before the 2022 ceremony. They had maintained the public presentation of a marriage while privately operating as two separate individuals who had been unable to make the relationship work after 25 years of trying. The specific language used to describe the moment of the slap is worth sitting with. Jada Pinkett Smith said she had not been at the Oscars as Will Smith's wife because they had not been in that relationship for years. When the slap happened, the first thought was that it had to be a skit. The second thought, when it became clear it was real, was that something had gone very wrong with someone who was in trouble, in a way that the public had no visibility into. The implications of that revelation for understanding what Jim Carrey had diagnosed 2 days after the incident are significant. A man who had been carrying the weight of a marriage that had privately collapsed 6 years earlier, who had spent those years maintaining a public image of family cohesion that required constant performance, who had built an entire professional brand on the concept of the loving husband and devoted father while privately living a very different reality, was sitting in the front row of the most public event in his industry when a joke touched something raw. The frustration that Carrey identified as the real source of the eruption suddenly had considerably more visible material to draw from. Jada Pinkett Smith's own description of what the moment meant for their relationship added a dimension that complicated the straightforward narrative of romantic protectiveness further. The slap, she said, brought them closer together after years of separation. She referred to it in one interview as the holy slap, describing the positive things that followed from it. That characterization, from the person on whose behalf the violence was ostensibly committed, introduced an irony into the story that resists simple resolution. An act that the industry's moral community was praised for excusing was described by its intended beneficiary as a catalyst for reconnection, despite the fact that she had not been at the ceremony as his wife and had described her first reaction to it as confusion rather than gratitude. What the disclosure of the separation confirmed most clearly is that the public image of Will Smith that had been so carefully maintained across decades was more constructed than real, that the gap between the performed persona and the actual life had grown to a size that was no longer sustainable under pressure, and that what the cameras captured in March 2022 was the moment that gap finally became visible to everyone simultaneously. Carrey's observation that something frustrated was going on inside had been, as it turned out, an understatement. But what impact did it have on the world of comedy? The growing crises. The incident between Will Smith and Chris Rock was not an isolated shock to the comedy world. Just weeks later, another comedian was attacked while performing live, this time in a situation that many described as potentially deadly. During the Netflix is a Joke festival at the Hollywood Bowl, comedian Dave Chappelle was assaulted on stage in the middle of his set. The attack happened Tuesday night in front of a packed audience at the iconic Los Angeles venue, sending fresh waves of concern throughout the stand-up community. Police identified the suspect as 23-year-old Isaiah Lee, who authorities said was carrying a replica handgun fitted with a folding knife blade when he rushed the stage and tackled Chappelle. The weapon raised immediate alarms about how much worse the incident could have been. Lee was later arrested and held on $30,000 bail, and prosecutors moved forward with charges related to assault with a deadly weapon. The assault occurred toward the end of Chappelle's performance. Audience members initially appeared confused, unsure whether the moment was part of the act. Security and several individuals quickly subdued the attacker. In the aftermath, Chappelle maintained his composure and even continued joking. At one point, he quipped that the attacker was a trans man, referencing the ongoing controversy surrounding his Netflix special, The Closer, which had sparked criticism from members of the transgender community. Comedian Chris Rock, who was present at the event, joined Chappelle on stage afterward and made a pointed joke of his own. Was that Will Smith? The remark directly referenced the now infamous Oscars altercation and underscored how closely these incidents were being linked in public conversation. In the days following the attack, comedy club owners across the country began speaking out. Many expressed solidarity with Chappelle, while also urging venues to take stronger security precautions. Jamie Masada, owner of the Laugh Factory in Los Angeles, said the climate surrounding live comedy has shifted dramatically. The Laugh Factory, which first opened its doors in 1979, has long been considered a cornerstone of the stand-up scene. Masada described the situation as deeply troubling, suggesting that high-profile acts of onstage violence may embolden others seeking attention. He argued that when performers are physically confronted during live shows, it risks normalizing behavior that was once unthinkable in comedy clubs and theaters. According to him, some individuals may attempt to make a name for themselves by targeting whoever is on stage. For comedians, the attack reinforced growing anxieties about safety during performances. Stand-up has traditionally thrived on spontaneity, crowd interaction, and pushing boundaries, but recent events have prompted venue operators from coast to coast to reconsider security protocols, audience screening, and stage access. Despite the violence, Chappelle expressed gratitude to those who assisted him, including Jamie Foxx and Busta Rhymes. In typical fashion, he lightened the tension with humor, telling the crowd that, "Whenever you're in trouble, Jamie Foxx will show up in a sheriff's hat." Still, the broader message resonated beyond the laughter. For many in the comedy world, the attack signaled a serious turning point, one that forced the industry to confront difficult questions about safety, accountability, and the increasingly volatile intersection of entertainment and public reaction. So, how did the industry respond to these series of events? The industry's response and what it revealed about Hollywood. Jim Carrey's most pointed observation was not about Will Smith personally, it was about the room. The standing ovation, delivered to a man who had just committed an act of violence against a colleague in front of a global audience, was described as the clearest possible signal about the state of the entertainment industry's moral spine. That characterization provoked significant reaction, both from those who agreed and from those who found it too harsh. But examining what the industry actually did in the weeks and months following provides the most honest assessment of who was right. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences took approximately 2 weeks to announce formal consequences: a 10-year ban from attending the Oscars or any Academy events. Smith had already resigned his membership in the interim, removing the possibility of expulsion and allowing him to retain the Oscar one on the night of the slap. The ban was real, but notably did not extend to Smith's ability to be nominated for awards, receive recognition for work, or continue operating as an active member of the industry. The trophy stayed. The career paused but did not end. The studios, meanwhile, operated with the caution that the situation warranted for a period. Projects were delayed or quietly shelved. Netflix put a planned film on hold. Executives described a period of waiting to see who would move first, unwilling to be the studio that publicly backed Smith while the news cycle was still generating heat, but privately calculating whether and when the talent's commercial value would outweigh the reputational risk. The calculation that eventually emerged was the one Carrey had implicitly predicted by characterizing the industry as spineless. Commercial viability 1. Bad Boys. Ride or Die. The fourth installment of the franchise Smith had sustained with Martin Lawrence since 1995, opened in June 2024 to a global box office of over $289 million, confirming that the audience for Will Smith's commercial work had not disappeared in the wake of the Oscars incident, whatever had happened to his standing among critics and cultural commentators. The film was not a critical success. Reviews were mixed in ways that had become characteristic of the franchise regardless of Smith's personal circumstances. But it made money, and in Hollywood, that is the metric that tends to determine whether a career continues, rather than whether the broader culture has processed its feelings about a public incident. The studio's willingness to work with Smith again validated Carrey's diagnosis of the industry's character more precisely than any editorial could. The standing ovation was not an anomaly. It was a preview of how the situation would ultimately be handled. with a period of performance concern followed by a return to business when the financial calculus made business seem more important than the statement. The people who had given that standing ovation were the same people who greenlit the sequel 2 years later. The spinelessness Carrey identified was not a one-night failure. It was a structural condition. The slow unraveling that followed. Whatever narrative of inevitable comeback the Bad Boys box office appeared to support, the broader picture of Will Smith's post-Oscars trajectory is considerably more complicated and considerably less triumphant than the selective highlights would suggest. Emancipation, the Apple TV Plus film that was intended to be the serious artistic statement that restored the reputation after the slap, arrived in December 2022 to reviews that were adequate without being enthusiastic and an audience response that did not justify the $120 million acquisition price. The film was positioned as the comeback vehicle, and it did not function as one. The combination of the slap's shadow and a marketing challenge created by the discomfort of promoting a film with its star, when the star was simultaneously the subject of ongoing controversy, produced a result that satisfied nobody fully. The marriage situation continued generating its own headlines throughout the post-slap period. Jada Pinkett Smith's 2023 memoir tour added layer after layer of complexity to the public understanding of the Smith household, with disclosures about the separation, Jada's own mental health struggles, the nature of their arrangement since 2016, and the various complications of a marriage that had clearly been far less stable than the public-facing version had suggested for years. Each disclosure, while Jada's truth to tell, added to the cumulative impression that the family brand Will Smith had built as one of his most important professional assets had been operating on a foundation significantly less solid than advertised. In March 2025, a street in West Philadelphia was renamed Will Smith Way in a ceremony attended by the Philadelphia mayor, a moment of local recognition that reflected how differently the incident played in Smith's home community than in Hollywood's executive suites or in critical cultural commentary. The event was genuine and the recognition was real, but the contrast between that local celebration and what was happening simultaneously in the broader cultural conversation illustrated the fragmented nature of Smith's standing in 2025. The album, based on a true story, released March 28, 2025, was intended as the musical chapter of the ongoing redemption narrative, the first solo album in 20 years, featuring collaborations with Big Sean, Teyana Taylor, Jaden Smith, and DJ Jazzy Jeff, addressing the slap directly through lyrics and positioning the entire project as an act of personal honesty. The commercial response was devastating by any measure. The album sold approximately 268 physical copies in the United Kingdom. It did not appear on the Billboard 200 in the United States, marking the first time a solo Smith project had ever failed to chart. Pitchfork awarded it a score of 2.4 out of 10, describing it as a campaign platform rather than an artistic statement. Rolling Stone called it clunky. The album that was supposed to demonstrate that honesty and reflection had replaced the constructed image, failed to convince the people it most needed to reach. The summer 2025 tour of Europe that was announced alongside the album continued regardless of the commercial failure, running through Hamburg, Paris, and other cities, with Smith performing to audiences that were real, if not massive. A lawsuit filed in December 2025 by violinist Brian King Joseph alleged and wrongful termination connected to the tour, with Smith's legal team denying the claims as entirely untrue. The lawsuit added yet another layer to the already complicated picture of a public figure attempting to move forward while the past continued generating new complications. The series of events after the incident kept revealing deeper cracks that Jim Carrey subtly mentioned in his interview. What were these cracks? The deeper question that Jim Carrey's words still raise. Returning to what Jim Carrey actually said, and sitting with it in the context of everything that followed, the observation that holds up most durably is the one that was most easily dismissed at the time as speculation. The idea that something was going on inside Will Smith that was frustrated, that the outburst was an expression of internal pressure rather than a genuine response to a joke about a haircut. The years between March 2022 and early 2026 have provided the context that makes that observation look less like psychological speculation and more like an accurate description of a person carrying an unsustainable load. A marriage that had been privately ending for 6 years while being publicly performed as intact. The highly publicized entanglement with their son's friend also added a deep strain to the relationship Will Smith was protecting at the expense of his career. The professional identity built around a character, the loving husband, the devoted father, the morally impeccable family man, that bore an increasingly complicated relationship to the private reality. A career that had reached its objective peak, the Academy Award that had been the target of decades of strategic positioning, at precisely the moment when everything underneath that career was most unstable. The pressure of all of that, pressing against the seams of a very public night, produced a visible crack that the world watched happen in real time. The broader question Carrey raised, about what an industry reveals about itself when it stands and applauds violence because the person committing it is commercially valuable, has never been answered in a way that contradicts the original diagnosis. Hollywood made a sequel. Hollywood presented the Grammy Awards to Smith in 2025 as a presenting opportunity. Hollywood continued calculating the distance between what was right and what was profitable and landing, predictably, in the same place it has always landed. The standing ovation was not the aberration. It was the policy, briefly made visible. What makes the situation genuinely tragic rather than merely cautionary is not that Will Smith threw away a career. Bad Boys, Ride or Die made nearly $300 million globally, and additional films including Hancock 2 and I Am Legend 2 remain in development. The career is damaged, but not destroyed. What is genuinely sad is the picture that has emerged of a person whose entire public architecture was built on a performance of wholeness that did not match the internal reality, who reached the pinnacle of professional validation at precisely the moment when the internal architecture was most compromised, and who expressed that compression in a way that will be permanently attached to the name and the legacy, regardless of what comes after. Jim Carrey said Will Smith had something going on inside that was frustrating. Everything that has come out in the years since suggests the frustration was considerably more substantial than a comedian's joke could account for, and that the world witnessed not a husband defending a wife, but a man under enormous internal pressure reaching a breaking point in a very public room. The diagnosis delivered 2 days after the incident has aged better than almost anything else said about that night. So, with all that has happened, where is Will Smith today? Is he waiting for the storm to pass over, or is he doing his best to help the world see past his weakness? Where things stand in 2026 and what it all adds up to. By early 2026, the picture of what really happened to Will Smith has considerably more detail than the single image that circulated everywhere in March 2022. The career has not ended, but its shape has permanently changed. The string of blockbusters, the pristine family image, the reputation as the industry's most reliably bankable and morally coherent major star, none of those things survived the decade intact. What remains is something more complicated and more honest. A talented performer with a genuinely remarkable body of work, a 10-year ban from the ceremony whose recognition he most coveted, a marriage that exists in a form the public still does not fully understand, and an album that almost nobody bought. The lawsuit filed by Brian King Joseph in December 2025, with its allegations of sexual misconduct and wrongful termination, represents the most recent addition to a list of complications that continues to grow even as the active news cycle around the 2022 incident has quieted. Smith's legal team has denied the allegations categorically. The matter remains unresolved as of the time of this writing. Whether it adds materially to the ongoing story or becomes a footnote will depend on how proceedings develop in the coming months. The films in development, Fast and Loose, Hancock 2, I Am Legend 2, and the Planes, Trains, and Automobiles remake with Kevin Hart represent an industry that has calculated, correctly based on the Bad Boys evidence, that Will Smith's name still opens doors and generates revenue in certain contexts. The industry Carrey described as spineless is behaving exactly the way he predicted it would, applying commercial logic to decisions that the discourse around the original incident had briefly suggested might operate on different principles. Jim Carrey himself has remained largely removed from major film and television work in the period since the interview, a career choice that reflects the philosophical evolution visible across his public statements and his artistic output over the past decade. The man who delivered the most pointed public assessment of what happened at the 94th Academy Awards has also been, in the years since, one of the people most visibly stepping back from the machinery he was criticizing. Whether that represents consistency or coincidence depends on how charitably the arc of his career is read, but it is notable that the loudest voice in the immediate aftermath belonged to someone who had already been developing his own complicated relationship with the industry he was condemning. The clearest takeaway from the full story of what happened to Will Smith, in the light of everything Jim Carrey said and everything the years since have confirmed, is that the slap was not the cause of what followed. It was the visible symptom of a private collapse that had been building for years, expressing itself on the biggest possible stage, in front of the biggest possible audience, in a way that made private denial impossible. The question of what happens next is not really about whether studios will keep greenlighting Will Smith projects. The commercial evidence suggests they will. The deeper question is whether a person who spent decades building a public self that did not fully match the private one can find a way to operate that requires less performance and more honesty, and whether the audience for that more honest version is large enough to build a second chapter on. That question does not have an answer yet, but Jim Carrey, in 2 Minutes of Television on March 29, 2022, asked it more clearly than almost anyone else did, and the years that followed have done nothing to suggest the question was the wrong one. So what do you think? Did Jim Carrey get it right about what was really happening with Will Smith that night? And do you believe the entertainment industry handled the aftermath the way it should have? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.